Take the sign down." Alexandra Reed said those words at the entrance of Carter Mills Auto at 8:12 in the morning, and she said them the way a person says something that has already been decided, something that is already over. Two men in reflective vests stood beneath the old wooden sign mounted above the workshop door. One held a power drill. The other gripped an aluminum ladder. Behind them, the lawyer from Voss Industries had his briefcase open. An assistant held a tablet. A pickup truck from Crestline Development sat parked at the edge of the lot, with the engine running, as if whoever was inside had not expected to stay long. Carter Mills slid out from under the Bentley on the lift. His hands were dark with grease. His gray t-shirt had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin at the collar. His jeans were work jeans, meaning they had never been anything else. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had spent enough years being underestimated that he no longer found it surprising. He was 38 years old, a single father, the owner of a small repair shop in the Harwick Industrial District, which was the kind of neighborhood where the buildings were functional, and the people were left alone, and nobody from downtown came unless they wanted something. He looked at the man about to set the drill bit into the first mounting screw. "Stop." Alexandra turned to face him. Her smile was the thin kind, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind worn by people who have already calculated how long a conversation will take. "Mr. Mills, Voss Industries is formally reclaiming the East Block premises under Clause 14B. You have 21 days to vacate. Today we are simply beginning the site assessment and removing identifying elements that are inconsistent with the planned redevelopment." Carter used the rag tucked into his back pocket to clean his hands. He did it slowly, one finger at a time. "You're taking my sign down before my lease expires." The lawyer stepped forward. His name was Bradley Vance, and he had the practiced posture of a man who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. "The signage is mounted on Voss Industries property. The company has the right to prepare the site." Carter looked at Alexandra. "Then you didn't come here to notify me. You came here to humiliate me." The air inside the shop tightened. One of the workers in the reflective vests shifted his weight. The assistant with the tablet stopped typing. Alexandra didn't blink. "I came here to remove elements that no longer belong to the company's future." It was at that moment that the assistant adjusted the tablet screen, and Carter, who was close enough and observant enough, caught the subject line displayed in the open calendar entry. "Apex decision within 72 hours. Below it, a short note in smaller text. "Drivetrain tolerance failure. Plant 3. Contract loss risk." Carter turned back toward the Bentley. On the metal workbench beside the lift sat a bearing assembly he had pulled from the car that morning. The housing carried the supplier code of a secondary parts manufacturer. The interior bore surface showed wear that traveled in a pattern, not random, not gradual, but even cyclic, predictable. That wasn't age, that wasn't a bad car. That was the signature of a production line, cutting wrong on a schedule it didn't know it was keeping. He picked the assembly up. "If you sell East Block to Crestline to cover the shortfall, you'll lose Apex within 3 days." Alexandra's expression shifted towards something that wasn't quite amusement, but performed it convincingly. "A mechanic renting floor space is explaining industrial strategy to me." Carter set the bearing assembly back on the bench. "No, I'm showing you that your company isn't broken where you're selling. It's broken where you won't look." She stepped toward him. She was not a small woman, and she had learned long ago how to use her height, her posture, and her composure as a single unit. "You have 21 days to clear your tools. Don't spend that time imagining yourself at my conference table." Carter looked at the sign above the door. He looked at the notice on the workbench. He looked at the bearing assembly, and the code stamped into its housing. He said it very quietly. 21 days is enough." Alexandra turned and walked out, her lawyer and her assistant following, and the Crestline truck pulled away from the curb before the roller door had finished rattling on its tracks. She did not know that the man she had just ordered out of his shop had once saved all entire production line by identifying a deviation that no instrument had flagged, that the human ear alone had caught. She did not know that in the 21 days she had just handed him, Carter Mills would not simply prove where her company was failing. He would acquire enough control to stop her from selling it to the wrong people entirely. Owen Calloway arrived 40 minutes after Carter called him. He was 40 years old, a lawyer by training, and a careful man by disposition, and he had known Carter long enough to understand that when Carter's voice was that quiet on the phone, something real was in motion. He read the notice while Carter made coffee. He read it twice, which meant he had a problem with it on the first pass, and wanted to be sure on the second. Clause 14b authorizes reclamation for operational restructuring, Owen said. Not for a real estate sale. Crestline isn't part of Voss operations. No, it's a development company. So they're using an industrial clause to cover a property deal. Owen set the document on the workbench. If we can demonstrate the actual purpose is a sale, rather than restructuring, the 21-day notice may not hold. Carter poured 2 cups and pushed one across the bench. That's the legal angle. There's another one. He told Owen what he had seen on the tablet, the apex timeline, the plant 3 notation, the bearing assembly on the bench. Owen listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when the information being given to him was actually important. When Carter finished, Owen picked up the bearing and turned it under the light. You're saying the company is trying to solve a production problem by selling the real estate instead of fixing the line. I'm saying if I'm right about what's failing in Plant 3, the Apex contract can be saved. And if the Apex contract can be saved, there's no emergency requiring East Block to be sold. And if there's no emergency requiring East Block to be sold, the 14B notice loses its purpose. Owen set the bearing down. You're not trying to save the shop. I'm trying to find out if the shop needs saving at all. Alexandra had issued her notice at 8:12 in the morning. By 10:45, Carter had pulled the Voss Industries annual reports, the last 3 earnings calls, and every publicly available document related to Apex Automotive's supplier contracts. He spread them across the bench, the way he spread a disassembled engine, component by component, looking for what wasn't supposed to be there. The numbers told a story that financial language was specifically designed to obscure. Quality control costs had dropped over 18 months, while warranty return rates climbed. Raw material sourcing had shifted twice in the same period. Plant 3 output had grown, but so had rework labor hours, which meant the machines were making things that the floor workers were fixing by hand before shipping. You could read it as growth under pressure, or you could read it as a production line that had started lying to the people managing it. Carter closed the laptop at midnight, turned off the workbench lamp, and sat in the dark for a moment with the kind of stillness that comes not from having no thoughts, but from having one thought and following it very carefully to its end. Then he reached for his phone and dialed Julian Frost. 6 years before the morning Alexandra Reed arrived with a drill team and a legal notice, Carter Mills had not lived among oil and wrench sets and the smell of brake fluid. He had sat in glass-walled conference rooms at Meridian Auto Group, where the chairs cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the coffee came in, labeled Carafees, and the people around the table wore their authority-like, pressed clothing they had learned to move in without wrinkling. His title was Vice President of Manufacturing Engineering. His job was to find the things that were wrong before they became the things that ended up on television. He was not the kind of executive who gave speeches. He did not manage by charisma or by committee. He managed by listening, specifically to the sounds that machines made when they were doing something other than what the settings said they were doing. He had once identified a tolerance error in a Meridian drivetrain component that had passed every automated quality check, passed every manual spot inspection, and was about to ship in volume to 11 markets. The error was not large. It was a deviation of less than 1/1000th of an inch, but it repeated on a cycle. And that cycle matched exactly the wear pattern that would appear in the field after 12,000 miles, and Carter had heard it in the sound of a test unit spinning at low RPM in a room where everyone else had heard nothing at all. The recall that didn't happen because of that afternoon saved Meridian an amount of money that was not discussed in press releases. It was discussed in private, in handshakes, in the kind of institutional memory that organizations carry forward when they want to understand why a particular person should be treated carefully. Then Emily got sick. Her name was Emily Mills, and she had married Carter when they were both young enough to believe that the future was simply the present but larger. And she had been wrong about that, and so had he, but they had been wrong about it together for long enough that it became a different kind of truth. The illness was not swift. It was the kind that takes its time, and Carter had learned during those years to be the kind of man who showed up. Not the kind who managed the showing up from a distance, while other things were managed in his name. He had reduced his hours before anyone noticed, then reduced them more, before anyone said anything directly, and by the time Emily died, he had already made the quiet decision that the conference rooms and the caraffs and the titles were not the things he wanted to carry into whatever came next. He opened the shop in Harwick the spring after she passed. He did not hang his degrees on the wall. He did not mention Meridian to the other business owners in the district. He told his daughter, who was 7 years old, and already had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, that he was going to fix cars for a while, and she had accepted this, the way children accept things when they sense that the explanation behind it is too large for words. He fixed cars. He was exceptionally good at it. Customers came back, not because he was cheap, but because he was the only mechanic in the district who would tell you the truth about what a repair would cost before he started, and then charge you exactly that. And that was all that Carter Mills was supposed to be, in Harwick, in the industrial district. In the building, with the sign that Alexandra Reed's workers had almost taken down. Owen had seen it before. Carter had allowed himself to say it plainly. On the night, Carter reopened the investment accounts he had not touched since leaving Meridian. Owen had leaned over the screen, looked at the figures, and said, "You never really left that world. You just turned the lights off in the room." Carter hadn't disagreed. Julian Frost picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. They had worked together at Meridian a decade before, and the relationship between them had the quality of trust built not through sentiment, but through the sustained experience of working on problems that had real consequences. Julian now ran supply chain operations at Apex Automotive, which was among the largest drivetrain procurement contracts in the Great Lakes region. Carter asked his question directly. Is Voss losing the Apex contract because of price or because of product? Julian was quiet for 3 seconds. Because of confidence. He explained it without being asked for elaboration. Apex had begun tracking Voss performance carefully after 3 sequential shipments arrived with parts that passed documented specifications but failed early in service testing. 2 deliveries had arrived outside the tolerance window, one by a margin that was arguable, and one by a margin that was not. A quality audit report submitted by Voss had been internally flagged at Apex as presenting data inconsistent with the field returns. Nobody had accused anyone of falsifying anything formally, but nobody at Apex believed the numbers anymore either. If one more quarter passed without demonstrable improvement, the contract would move to a manufacturer in Ohio. Carter asked whether anyone inside Voss understood where the production failure was originating. Julian said that Diana Marsh, the company's chief financial officer, had requested a temporary shutdown of Plant 3's drivetrain line to conduct a diagnostic on the CNC cutters 3 months ago. Alexandra had declined. Shutting down a line meant admitting there was a line to shut down. The Crestline deal had presented itself as a cleaner path. Sell the East Block real estate, improve the balance sheet, stabilize investor confidence, buy time. Carter thanked Julian and ended the call. He sat for a while with what he now had. Plant 3, the CNC line, a cyclic tolerance deviation. A management team that had chosen to sell real estate rather than look at what the machines were doing. He pulled up the bearing assembly photograph again on his laptop and set it beside the Voss quality documentation. The wear pattern matched. Not approximately, precisely, the same deviation, the same interval, the same geometry of error. The Bentley in his shop had been serviced at 3 different repair facilities in the prior 18 months. The owner, an older gentleman who had been in the automotive parts distribution business for 40 years, had accepted the explanation each time that the vibration was simply the nature of a high-mileage vehicle. Carter had known within 10 minutes that the vibration was the nature of a batch of replacement bearings that had been machined by a secondary supplier who sourced from a manufacturer with a cyclic deviation in their cutter calibration. The Bentley was not a Voss product. But the bearing manufacturer who had supplied the replacement parts was the same secondary supplier Voss used for Plant 3 drivetrain components. The failure was not contained. It had already shipped. It had already reached customers. It was sitting inside vehicles right now, running within tolerance at the start of each day, and failing at the edge of it by the end. Carter began to write. He did not write to Alexandra. He wrote to Owen, outlining what he had found and what he believed the implications were. Then he wrote to Julian, a single-page technical summary with photographs, measurements, and a proposed failure mechanism. Julian's reply arrived at 2 a.m. "This is what we've been waiting for Voss to say for 6 months. How are you in contact with this?" Carter set the laptop down, looked at the Bentley, and said nothing to the empty shop. Alexandra returned to the shop on the 7th day. She came expecting the beginning of departure, boxes, cleared shelving, the visible signs of a man accepting what had been formally decided. Instead, the shop was entirely unchanged. The tools were where they had always been. The Bentley was still on the lift. The sign was still above the door. She told him she could have the legal team follow up if the terms needed clarification. Carter said he understood the terms. She told him that people in his position often developed an attachment to a space that was disproportionate to its value, and that the difficulty of leaving was not a legitimate basis for delay. Carter lifted the bearing assembly from the workbench and set it on the surface between them. "Your company is selling real estate to cover a fault that looks exactly like this." Alexandra looked at the bearing the way a person looks at an object that has been placed in front of them by someone attempting to prove a point that has no bearing on the actual conversation. "Where are you getting your information?" "From the product." She informed him that she sourced industrial intelligence from credentialed analysts and industry databases, not from mechanics working out of leased industrial units in Harwick. "The vibration in that car," Carter said, "started at low RPM and only appeared in a specific speed band. 3 other shops checked it. None of them found it. It's a bearing failure, but not from age. It's from a cyclic deviation in the manufacturing of the replacement part. The same deviation, the same interval, the same signature as what's shipping out of Plant 3. Alexandra's assistant received a call. She stepped away, and Carter watched the assistant's expression change in the way expressions change when the information coming through the phone is not what was expected. When the assistant relayed the message quietly to Alexandra, Carter saw her jaw tighten for a fraction of a second before she reassembled her composure. Diana Marsh had forwarded an email. Apex had requested an urgent meeting. The meeting request included an attached technical brief from an external source. The external source was Carter Mills. Alexandra looked at him, not with the executive's look she had worn when she arrived, with the look of someone who has just realized they are standing in a room that is larger than they thought. She left without raising the question of the 21 days again. Carter knew she would now look up who he actually was. Diana Marsh had the answer in 15 minutes. She was 47 years old and had spent 12 of those years inside Voss Industries, which meant she had seen enough cycles of optimism and denial to recognize both without needing to be told which was which. She was not the kind of executive who told her CEO what she wanted to hear, which was possibly why she had remained chief financial officer rather than ascending further. She sent Alexandra a summary. Carter Mills, formerly Vice President of Manufacturing Engineering, Meridian Auto Group, 3 manufacturing patents, author of 2 industry studies on cyclic tolerance management, designer of a quality sampling protocol that had been adopted across 4 major production facilities, all following a multi-million-dollar recall event that the protocol itself had prevented. Alexandra read it while sitting in the back of a car. She read it twice. Then she called Diana and asked her to arrange a review of Plant 3's CNC line. Marcus Bell, the plant manager, submitted a rapid assessment within 4 hours, confirming that all measurements were within acceptable parameters. Diana forwarded the report to Carter with a single line of her own. "Is this accurate?" Carter replied with a list of the specific data he would need to make a determination. Raw cut timing logs, spindle temperature readings across operating hours, per-shift scrap ratios, and the tooling replacement schedule for the past 8 months. Alexandra refused him access. She told him he did not have internal system authorization, which was accurate. Carter acknowledged that, and then presented her with a choice that had no comfortable middle ground. She could trust the rapid assessment that had been produced by the same management structures that had allowed the problem to develop, or she could grant access to someone who had repaired this class of failure before. Julian Frost's deadline arrived 2 days later. 72 hours, demonstrate a credible corrective plan or accept the contract transition. Alexandra authorized Carter's entry into Plant 3. He walked in wearing the same work jacket he wore at the shop. He carried a measuring tape, a notebook, a set of calibrated listening instruments, and the specific quietness of a man who has already formed a hypothesis and is now doing the work of either proving or disproving it, with complete willingness to accept either result. The plant floor was loud in the way all production floors are loud, not chaotic, but layered, with each machine contributing its own rhythm to the industrial whole. Carter stood at the entrance of the drivetrain line and listened for 60 seconds before walking toward the CNC cutting station. He asked the operator how long the machine had been running that shift. 3 hours and 40 minutes. He stood close enough to hear the cycle, not the cutting itself but the return motion, the brief arc the cutter head made between passes. He listened through 3 full cycles. On the 4th, he heard it, a sound so faint that under normal working conditions, with safety equipment in, a person standing 2 feet further away would not register it at all. A small variation in the return. A hesitation that was not a hesitation so much as a mechanical expression of imprecision in the return positioning. He asked for the machine to be stopped. Marcus Bell, standing nearby with an expression that managed to be both skeptical and defensive simultaneously, said they were running a time-sensitive production. Carter said, "You can lose 10 minutes now, or lose apex in 3 days." The machine stopped. Carter inspected the slide assembly, the position sensor, and the calibration log for the tooling holder. What he found was not a defective machine in the traditional sense. The tooling holder had been replaced at some point in the prior year with a compatible aftermarket version. Not counterfeit, not fraudulent, but sourced to a cost specification that differed from the OEM component in one narrow but meaningful way. Under normal operating temperatures, it performed within tolerance. But CNC machines on a production line do not operate at normal temperatures by the time the 3rd hour of a shift has passed. As the machine warmed, the aftermarket holder expanded at a rate that differed from the OEM specification by a value that was, in isolation, negligible. In 3 to 4 hours of continuous operation, the accumulated thermal expansion shifted the cutter return position by a margin sufficient to introduce a cyclic deviation in the finished parts. The quality sampling protocol drew from the beginning of each shift. The deviation manifested heaviest at the end. Diana Marsh, who had been standing at the back of the floor since Carter entered, and who had said nothing during the inspection, went pale. She had known something was wrong. She had not known what, specifically, but she had known that the rapid assessments were not telling the truth, because the truth would have required stopping the line and stopping the line had been repeatedly characterized as an overreaction. "Run the end-of-shift sample," Carter said. Margaret started to object. Alexandra, who had been watching the entire sequence without speaking, said, "Do it." The results came back 17 minutes later. The deviation was exactly where Carter had predicted it would be. The magnitude matched the bearing assembly, from the Bentley in Harwick, to within measurement error. Alexandra stood looking at the quality display screen for a long moment. When she turned to Carter, something in her face had changed, not softened. Exactly. The word for what it did was more precise than that. It acknowledged. "You weren't guessing," she said. Carter picked up his notebook. "I was reading. Your plant has been writing the same sentence in every part it ships for about 8 months. Nobody was reading it." He paused at the end of the line, looking back at the machine. "Your company isn't dying. It's telling you where it hurts. The problem is that the people responsible for listening decided it was easier to sell the building than to hear it." Grant Huxley called Alexandra the following morning. He was 52 years old and had built Crestline Development into a regional force through a consistent strategy. Identify distressed commercial property, acquire it below assessed value during moments of institutional crisis, and sell it to investment vehicles at a premium that reflected what the property would be worth once the distress was resolved. He was not cruel about this. He was simply unsentimental about other people's difficulties in the way that a person can be when the difficulty represents an opportunity, and the person has become accustomed to thinking in those terms. He had known about Apex for 2 months. He had known about Plant 3 for 6 weeks. He had moved quickly on East Block precisely because he understood that a company losing its largest manufacturing contract would be willing to sell strategic real estate at a price that would look reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect. Now a mechanic from Harwick had walked into the plant and found the problem in an afternoon, and if the problem could be fixed, there was no emergency, and if there was no emergency, there was no deal. He told Alexandra that the technical review was premature, and that an outside consultant with unclear credentials was not a sound basis for postponing a transaction of this magnitude. He told her that the window for the preferred pricing was limited. He told her that the market did not wait for sentiment. Alexandra listened and said very little. After the call ended, she sat in her office and laid out what she actually knew. Grant had approached her with the East Block offer within 3 weeks of the first Apex warning letter. The offer had come through Bradley Vance. Bradley Vance had drafted the 14B clause language, and 3 days after Carter had identified the specific source of the Plant 3 deviation, Diana had mentioned in a routine file transfer that a draft version of the 14B language had been sent to Crestline's legal team prior to any board discussion. The document had been sent by Bradley Vance prior to any board discussion, which meant the purpose of the eviction notice Carter had received was not to accelerate site preparation for a redevelopment that had not been approved. It was to clear the property before the transaction was formalized at the direction of a lawyer who had been working both sides of the deal. Alexandra called Diana. "How many board members know what Bradley sent to Crestline?" Diana was quiet for a moment. "None of them. I'm the only one who has the timestamp." Alexandra hung up and sat for a long time in a room that had gone very quiet. The plan Carter proposed was specific and unglamorous, and exactly right. Stop Plant 3's drivetrain line for 48 hours. Replace the aftermarket tooling holder with the OEM specification part. Recalibrate the CNC cutters to account for the thermal cycle they had been operating under. Shift quality sampling to end of shift rather than beginning of shift. Run a full production batch under the corrected conditions. Document everything. Send Apex the complete diagnostic record, the corrective action log, and the results of the test run, along with a formal explanation of what had failed and precisely how it had been addressed. Do not send a polished summary. Send the raw data. He sat across from Alexandra in the conference room on the 3rd floor and told her this while Diana listened from her seat at the corner of the table. Alexandra asked him why he was helping her company. She did not ask it aggressively. She asked it the way someone asks a question they have been considering for several days and have not been able to answer themselves. Carter held his coffee cup with both hands. I'm not helping you protect your position. I'm preventing a company from selling the parts of itself that hold it together in order to hide a problem. Can be fixed. That's not a favor. That's what someone does when they understand what's actually broken. Alexandra looked at him. After what I did with that notice, after the sign is still up. There was a pause. It shouldn't have been done that way, she said. Carter set his cup down. No, it shouldn't. They looked at each other across the table, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more functional than that. It was the mutual recognition of two people who had now seen each other's actual competence and actual mistakes clearly enough that the performance was no longer necessary. That evening, Carter called Owen. He told Owen what he had found in the plant. He told Owen what Diana had found in the file timestamps. He told Owen what he believed Grant Huxley had known, and when he had known it. Then he said the thing he had been building toward for 11 days. I want to buy into Voss. Owen said nothing for several seconds. The stock has dropped 40% since the Apex story went public. Yes, a concentrated purchase through the right vehicles would. I know what it would do. Owen said, tell me how much you want to hold. Carter told him. Owen was quiet for a long time. You'd have controlling interest. That's the idea. Owen exhaled slowly. You weren't fixing a shop. You were reading a company the whole time. Carter looked out the window of the shop at the sign above the door, the one that still bore his name, the one that had been 30 seconds from coming down 11 days ago. I was doing both, he said. The 14 days that followed were a form of parallel construction. In the daylight hours, Carter was in Plant 3. He did not replace the floor workers. He stood beside them. He explained what the deviation was and where it had come from, and why the sampling protocol had failed to catch it. He showed the operator on the CNC station how the sound of the return motion changed as the shift progressed and the machine warmed, and he asked the operator if he had ever noticed that. The operator said yes. He had mentioned it to Marcus twice, and both times Marcus had said the machine was within spec and to keep running. Carter wrote that down. He went through the corrective process one step at a time, in order, with the people who would be responsible for maintaining it after he was gone. Diana was beside him for much of it, taking notes, asking questions that were sometimes technical and sometimes financial, understanding that the two were not as separate as the org chart had suggested. At night, Owen worked the other side of the problem. A group of minority shareholders, who had held Voss positions since before Alexandra's tenure, had been growing increasingly dissatisfied with the East Bloc strategy, which had never been fully explained to the board, and which was now appearing in financial press coverage in ways that were difficult for the company to rebut. Several of these shareholders had reached out to Owen informally, not knowing what Owen was building, simply expressing a willingness to sell positions they no longer had confidence in. Owen structured the purchases carefully. He used entities that had held industrial positions for years and had legitimate reasons to be interested in a manufacturing company at a discount. One of those entities was an industrial fund that Carter had invested in during his Meridian years through a vehicle he had never liquidated. The fund had been patient for a long time, which was how good industrial investments worked. Now it moved. No press coverage, no shareholder letters, no indication to anyone inside Voss that something was being assembled from outside. On the 18th day of the 21, Apex received the first shipment from the corrected line. It was a partial batch, clearly labeled as a quality verification run, accompanied by the full technical documentation Carter had specified. Julian Frost forwarded it to the Apex engineering team without editorial comment. On the 19th day, Julian called Carter directly. The team reviewed the batch. It's within spec. Not barely, cleanly. He paused. We're going to hold our decision pending a full quarter review. No announcement yet. But you should know the conversation has changed. Carter thanked him and said nothing further, because there was nothing further required. On the 20th day, Grant Huxley sent Alexandra a letter through Bradley Vance. The letter stated that if she did not execute the East Block sale agreement within 48 hours, Crestline would withdraw the current source offer, and the transaction would need to be renegotiated under less favorable terms. The implication was pressure. The actual meaning was that Crestline could feel the ground shifting under the deal and wanted to lock it in before the shift became visible to anyone else. Alexandra read the letter in her office, alone, and set it face down on her desk. She had two directions she could move: sign and take the money, and have something to show the board that quarter, or trust that a drivetrain correction in Plant 3 and a quality verification batch sent to a client on the 19th day of a 21-day countdown constituted enough of a foundation to build on. She had spent her career making decisions on the basis of what she could demonstrate. She was not a person who acted on belief when evidence was unavailable. But she had also spent her career. She was beginning to understand, looking at the evidence she found convenient, and declining to look at the evidence that required her to stop what she was already doing. On the 21st morning, she drove to Harwick. She brought Bradley Vance. Her intention, insofar as she had formed one, was to offer an extension of the 21-day period in exchange for Carter's formal agreement not to challenge the 14B clause through the courts. She believed she was offering a compromise. She had come to negotiate something she still thought of as within her control. The shop door was open. Owen Calloway was standing inside, at the workbench, in a suit that had not been purchased in Harwick. On the workbench, beside the bearing assembly and a coffee cup and a set of technical drawings that Carter had been working from, was a bound document. Owen picked it up and set it in front of Alexandra without speaking. She opened it. It took her approximately 40 seconds to understand what she was reading: share transfer confirmations, ownership certifications, beneficial interest disclosures filed with the relevant regulatory bodies. Carter Mills, through a consortium of investment vehicles that had been patient and quiet and completely invisible for 3 weeks, had acquired a controlling interest in Voss Industries. He was standing behind her when she finished reading, in the same gray t-shirt and work jeans he had been wearing the morning she arrived with a power drill and a legal notice and a truck from Crestline Development with the engine running. Alexandra closed the document. She stood in the middle of the shop, a shop that still had its sign, a shop that was still in operation, a shop whose owner had just become, in the most formal and irrevocable sense, the person with final authority over the company that had tried to remove him from it, and she was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said, "You used the 21 days." Carter said, "You gave them to me." The Voss Industries board meeting took place the following morning. Carter arrived in the same jacket he had worn into Plant 3. He did not use the meeting to settle anything personal, because nothing that was about to happen was personal. It was institutional, and the distinction mattered to him. The first item was the termination of the East Block sale agreement with Crestline Development, on the grounds that the enabling clause had been applied outside its authorized scope, and that the Crestline legal team had received proprietary documentation prior to board authorization, which constituted a conflict of interest requiring formal review. Bradley Vance was not present. He had submitted a withdrawal from representation that morning, which told its own story without needing elaboration. The second item was authorization of a formal investigation into the documentation sharing, which Diana would oversee with outside counsel. The third item was the adoption of the Plant 3 Corrective Action Plan as a company-wide quality protocol, including the shift in sampling methodology, the tooling specification requirements, and a review period for all secondary supplier substitutions. The fourth item was Alexandra Reed's continued role as CEO under a modified governance structure. Carter did not remove her. He altered the conditions of the position so that unilateral decisions regarding strategic assets required board-level review, and that manufacturing decisions required consultation with the technical oversight function, which Carter would hold in a capacity that was advisory in title and operational in practice. Alexandra had expected to be dismissed. When she understood that she wasn't, she looked at him with an expression that was closer to confusion than gratitude, because gratitude would have implied that she had earned something, and she was self-aware enough to know she had not. Carter said, simply, "You know this company better than I do. You made the wrong call because you were looking at the wrong problem. That doesn't mean you can't look at the right one from here." She didn't reply. He hadn't expected her to. In the months that followed, the plant ran clean. Apex maintained the contract through the quarter, then through the next. The full volume was restored 6 months after the corrective action, with a letter from Julian Frost that was brief and technical, and said exactly what it needed to say. East Block remained part of the Voss portfolio. The buildings were not redeveloped or sold. They continued to house the operations they had always housed, including a small automotive repair shop that kept its sign mounted above the door, a wooden sign that had been one turn of a drill bit from being taken down on a Tuesday morning in the industrial district of Harwick. The quality sampling protocol was formalized into a written standard and distributed to every manufacturing site in the Voss network. It bore no authorship credit in the version sent to the plants. Carter had not asked for one. Marcus Bell was reassigned. He was not fired. He was moved to a role where his preference for smooth reporting would cause less systemic damage, and where someone would be regularly reviewing his assessments against the raw data. Grant Huxley found another property. He always did. That was the nature of his business, and Carter held no particular animus toward it. The deal that had been built on Voss's distress simply became one that didn't close, filed away as a near miss that the development company's records would attribute to market conditions rather than to a man with a bearing assembly and a workbench in Harwick. Carter kept the shop, not because it was all he had and not because he needed to hide from the world he had re-entered. He kept it because when he was under a car, hands on a system that had a specific, diagnosable problem and a specific, achievable solution, he could feel the honesty of the work in a way that conference rooms had never quite replicated. There were days when he drove from the Voss offices back to Harwick in the late afternoon and walked into the shop and changed out of the clothes he had worn to a board session and into the clothes he wore when he was fixing things, and those two sets of clothes occupied the same locker, and that did not seem like a contradiction to him. It seemed like the truth of what he actually was. On a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, Alexandra came to the shop. She did not send a message beforehand. She came the way a person comes when they are not sure they will be welcomed and have decided to find out directly. She was carrying a production report. It was thick, printed, tabbed along the edge with color coding that Carter recognized as Diana's organizational system. She set it on the workbench. "There's a section in the back," she said. "Plant 2. Secondary press line. The scrap ratios have been climbing for about 6 weeks, and I don't know if it's tooling or programming or something in the feed system." Carter wiped his hands on the rag that was always in his back pocket. He looked at the report. He looked at Alexandra. "You're asking before you decide what to do about it." She met his eyes. "Yes." Carter picked up the report and opened to the back section. The numbers were there, the way numbers always were. Patient, unembellished, waiting for someone with the right frame of reference to read what they were actually saying. He pulled a stool up to the workbench, set the report under the light, and began to read. Because the company had not been saved by the person with the most authority in the room. It had been saved by the person who was calm enough to look at a small deviation and say what it meant before the entire system sold itself to conceal it. And that was a thing worth continuing to be.